Ian McIntyre joins us from the Vancouver Sun. Ian, thanks so much for joining us. What, in your estimation, whether it is the head coach, whether it's David Booth, whether it's the new management structure, or maybe something we're all missing, what's the biggest story in your mind right now in Vancouver?
Well, the coaching search obviously is a big story, but it's kind of been a slow boil here. You know, the team has been very secretive. It's interesting this time around because we went through this a year ago, and there were a lot of people, some of them named Aquilini from the owner's family, interviewing very few candidates. This time around, there's very few people interviewing quite a few candidates. But I would say so far, in terms of news, one of the most interesting things that Jim Benning has done or not done is basically endorse the scouting staff and the apparatus and the management people that were already in place when he got here. Because there was a sense after the season they had, the house cleaning that occurred with both the GM, Mike Gillis, and John Tortorella gone, that there was going to be change throughout the organization. Now, it's very hard to change your scouting staff, you know, a month before a draft. But they had their scouting meetings last week in Whistler, and from what Jim Benning told me, he was very impressed by the staff, by the system that they have, and it looks like the people that they've got are going to be staying in place beyond this draft.
Ian, where are the Vancouver fans now in terms of, I don't know if the right word's pace to all of this?
Yeah. I think there was a lot of demand for change, and I think that appetite is not quelled simply by changing the coach and the GM. But I think, to their credit, the Canucks also understand that they've got to repair some of this relationship with their fans. And although Jim Benning hasn't been available to the media all that often, he has done several town hall meetings with Trevor Linden, the new president, at his side, where they talk to fans and they try to explain what they're doing. I think it was surprising to some initially. It wasn't to me, but it was surprising to some initially when, and it happened when both Trevor was hired and when Jim Benning was hired, that each said this team is not far away and that they can be good next season. I absolutely think they can be good next season, but there was such a groundswell, a demand for something better than what the team has shown. Like people aren't satisfied having a decent regular season and then going out in the first round of the playoffs. They really want something more and something long term. But if that change is going to occur, it's obvious now that it's going to occur in really small steps and a piece or two at a time. There isn't going to be this wholesale revolution within the Canucks to change things.
So you're saying they're going to attempt to be a playoff team, and they'll move Kesler out and hopefully get some assets. One of them being a guy that can play right now and fill the second or third hole, and they're going to go out and get a number one goaltender.
Well, I know the first part for sure. I don't know what they're thinking on their goaltending. There's obviously questions about Lack, but Dougie, the first part, and I've heard you say it as well. They can be a playoff team. They've got pieces in place. They obviously have to be very careful with the Kesler trade because this is going to be one of the first defining moments for Jim Benning if and when he makes that trade. But the parts that they were demanding under the previous regime, I don't see that has necessarily changed. The names perhaps, but not the caliber of those parts, which is a decent, if not a star player to play now, but a decent player, preferably at center, and then a really good prospect. And if you get a draft pick out of it, you also get a draft pick. But they need the good player now, and they need the potential impact player later.
Ian, with Trevor holding a never-before NHL job title and Jim Benning the same thing, isn't there a sense that maybe you need a coach with some NHL experience for some of the guys that have been around?
Well, I thought that same thing, Nick, and I was surprised that they didn't go after Barry Trotz, because that just seemed like such a good fit for that reason, for experience and what guys bring to the table. But the more we go here on this slow boil search for a coach, the more it's pointing towards Willie Desjardins and John Stevens, and they've talked to, I think, 3 candidates. Benning said they'd like to talk to 4 or 5 others, and those are 2 that obviously they haven't yet talked to. They think that coaching experience, they being Benning and Linden, think that the coaching experience doesn't have to include head coaching experience, although John Stevens does have some of that. They think it's more a breadth of work, and having had success at all levels, and certainly in the case of Willie Desjardins and Stevens, you can make, it's not hard to make that case that they have been successful everywhere they've been to this point.
You know, you look at their team, and you really are challenged to evaluate when you start talking about can they make the playoffs, because there was a time last year in December where they looked like they were going to challenge for the top of the conference and division, you know, and then it just totally went off the rail. So it's hard to really give a fair evaluation. There are some good pieces, and I think it's much like a San Jose situation where you've got to tear things down is one thing. To build it back up is really, really tough. So you got to be careful when you're moved to that phase, and I think they're smarter than that.
Yeah. Well, I think what's happened is, you know, they've got these 10 no trade clauses now, or it will be 10 on July 1st when Jannik Hansen's deal activates. It makes it very difficult, as you guys know.
Jannik Hansen is a no trade?
Yes, he does.
Oh my God.
Yes, he does. It's part of the problem. So essentially it becomes, you know, it's a very daunting thing if you look at the roster in its entirety and say, well, okay, we need to turn this over. How are we going to do it? Well, you can't, not with all those. But you could certainly try and pick away at it, 1 or 2 guys a year. And those, as we saw with Luongo, are complicated deals because it's a 3-way trade, the players involved. But you can do it, chipping away 1 or 2 a year. The problem with this organization is that renovation should have begun 2 or 3 years ago. There's an argument you could be made. It should have begun right after the Stanley Cup final loss, which was only 3 years ago. It seems 10 years ago now. But nothing has happened to their core to make it younger, to refresh it. And so the longer this goes, the more impossible the task looks at renovating and rebuilding this team. But I do think that Benning and Linden realize that they can't just go status quo. Although they have good pieces in place, and although they should, with the right coach, make the playoffs next year, although the goaltending is still a big question, you can't just say, okay, we're a 100-point team, we're not changing anyone, and we'll look at this again in 2015. They have to start that. And obviously, if they move Kesler, that's a huge, huge start to that process. But Kesler alone is not enough. In my mind, they need to do, 2 players a year from that core, turn it over. But
in all seriousness, when you look at that conference and that division, you're going to make the playoffs with Eddie Lack as your number 1 goaltender. That is putting a tremendous amount of pressure on a first-year coach. Yeah. Well, Lack was like the team last year, where he was very good. In fact, he was probably better than the team because it was only the last 6 weeks that Lack wasn't as good as he'd been. But of course, the unsettling part is that coincides with when he suddenly had to be the starter. Yeah, instead of Roberto Luongo. Look, not a knock on him, Ian, except he just hasn't done it. That's the challenge. Exactly, and as we've seen innumerable times in this league, until you're a number 1 goalie, you're not a number 1 goalie. Right. You can be impressive as a backup, but that doesn't mean you're the number 1. Nobody here, I think, in Vancouver is under any illusion that barring change beyond what we've been talking about, barring something more than just a good Kesler trade, making the playoffs is one thing. Getting out of the Pacific Division in this new playoff format is just, it's beyond them right now. Do they want to go to the East?
I'm sure Gary would listen.
I think, did they not start there? I'm trying to think of expansion.
They did. They did in 1970. You're right.
Yeah, they
Ian-
should try to get back there.
Speaking of trying to make a good Kesler trade, how do you do that right now when it's so abundantly clear he wants out all over again, and you don't want this turning into Luongo Part 2?
No, but the difference...
He has to go, and he has to go pretty quickly here.
Yeah, the key difference, of course, is that Luongo, so much of what occurred or didn't occur was due to his contract, and Kesler is the polar opposite, where his contract is tremendously attractive to have 2 more years at $5 million, and presumably whichever team gets him, he's going to want to go there, and so there's a good chance that they can re-sign him. So it's not a rental. You're getting a guy pretty close to his prime. I'm not sure he's ever going to be the player he was 3 years ago, but he's still a very effective player, and there's a lot of interest in him. One of the factors now is, with Spezza on the market, and who knows, for instance, does Mike Richards get bought out? And Joe Thornton is available. There are other top centers out there, but in my mind, there's very few Ryan Kesslers who bring that skill set, and I think there will be a lot of demand. The question will be, is Jim Benning going to hold out for a home run deal, or is he willing to get a double? Because Mike Gillis at the trade deadline probably could have had a solid double, but they just thought Kesler was so important. I don't blame them for this. They thought Kesler was so important, they had to make the absolute best deal they could get, and they didn't think that was it. It'll be interesting to see where that standard is for Jim Benning and Trevor Linden, and whether they feel like they can wait for the absolute best deal for them, or just make a good deal at the draft and move on. Speaking
of the draft, and last one for you, Ian, we'll let you get on with your day. Is there any way that Willie Nylander, the Swede, the big explosive scorer, makes it past the Vancouver Canucks at 6?
It's possible. I mean, it's almost, the first round, you often talk about the drop-off, and this year it seems from what I've read and what I've heard from scouts is there's like 2 little classes in the top 10. There's your first 4 that has the 3 big centers and Ekblad, the defenseman, and then you have another group of 5 or 6 primarily wingers. Now I think the Canucks would like to get a center, but if they're picking at 6, they're not going to get one of the top 3 centers, so they're going to take a winger. Nylander can play center as well. I think they like they're looking for some size, so maybe Nylander wouldn't be their guy. I think it's possible. How's that for an answer?
Not bad.
It's possible they don't take Nylander. I don't think by any means that they're absolutely sold on the idea of picking Willie Nylander.
That big center Leon isn't sliding to 6.
Draisaitl, yeah.
No.
And does Ritchie, Calgary, how do Calgary let the big center?
Nick Ritchie, I don't know how they let Nick Ritchie go past. And then there's Michael Del Cole.
Like Del Cole and Leon and
Draisaitl, yeah.
Draisaitl.
From Prince Albert.
And Ritchie. I mean, there's some interesting names there.
Yeah, and Draisaitl is going to go, I think, top 4.
Right. He looks like he will.
Along with the 2 smaller skill guys as well. So if the Canucks don't move, they're probably taking a winger, but then in that case, maybe they move down a couple of spots. If somebody really has their eye on a winger, and the Canucks will take who's left at 9 or 10.
Sure, and pick up a second-round pick in the prospect. Ian, thanks so much for sharing your expertise. We appreciate it.
Thanks,
Ian.
All right, see you guys.
Ian McIntyre, Vancouver's son.